You shake a man's hand at a backyard barbecue, and before he's even finished saying his name, some part of you has already made a judgment. Firm grip, dry palm, a squeeze with a little intention behind it. You file him under solid, capable, a man who fixes his own gutters. Loose, damp, barely there, and something in the back of your mind quietly notes it, even if you'd never say it out loud. We've always treated a handshake like it's revealing character. Turns out, we were closer to the truth than we ever meant to be, just not in the way we thought. Because that same grip, the one you use wrestling the lid off a stubborn jar of pickles, hauling 2 grocery bags up the porch steps in one trip because you refused to make 2, wringing out a wet towel without giving it a second thought, gripping a steering wheel through an icy patch of road. That grip is quietly keeping score on something far bigger than character. It's tracking your whole body. Researchers followed more than 140,000 people across 17 different countries, from busy cities to small farming towns, and found that this ordinary, everyday squeeze predicts how long a person lives, and how well, more accurately than the number your doctor gets from wrapping that inflatable cuff around your arm. Not the blood pressure cuff. Your grip. There's an old phrase we've all used 1,000 times without thinking twice about it. Get a grip. We say it to someone who's rattled, someone who's coming apart a little at the edges, as if a steady hand and a steady self were somehow the same thing. Maybe that phrase was never just a figure of speech. Maybe some older, more observant version of us noticed this connection long before anyone owned a dynamometer to prove it. Sit with that for a second, because on the surface, it doesn't make much sense. Blood pressure has decades of machinery behind it. Guidelines, medications, entire branches of medicine built around that one number ticking up or down. And here's a plain, unglamorous squeeze of the hand, quietly outperforming all of it. So what exactly is this thing? And why would the body wire something this important into a gesture as ordinary as a handshake? Something we've all been doing since we were kids without giving it a second thought. Let's start with what grip strength actually measures, because it's simpler than it sounds, and more revealing than you'd expect. When you close your hand around something, a jar lid, a garden hose, a grandchild's small hand at the fair, you're not just using the little muscles tucked into your palm. You're recruiting muscles running the length of your forearm, powerful tendons that travel clear up past your elbow, and a nervous system that has to fire off dozens of precise signals in the right order and at the right intensity for that squeeze to actually hold. A dynamometer, the simple handheld device researchers use to measure grip, just spits out a number in kilograms. But behind that one number sits an entire coordinated performance between muscle, tendon, and nerve, all working in concert without you ever thinking about any of it. The test itself is almost comically unglamorous. A person sits with their elbow bent, takes hold of a small handheld device, and squeezes as hard as they comfortably can, usually a couple of times on each hand so the researcher can note the strongest reading. No treadmill, no blood draw, no machine that hums and beeps for 20 minutes. Just a squeeze, over in a few seconds. The kind of thing you could do standing in a kitchen. That plainness is almost part of the point. Nobody would guess, watching it happen, that they were looking at one of the more telling health measurements a person can take. It helps to picture it like listening to a full orchestra through a single microphone. You don't hear each instrument on its own. But if the cello section is dragging, or the horns come in a half beat late, you'll hear it in that one signal, even without being able to point to exactly which instrument is off. Grip strength works the same way. It's not that a strong hand somehow protects a person all by itself. It's that a strong, steady hand is evidence of a well-run whole, muscle that's been kept up, a nervous system still firing cleanly, nutrition that's kept pace with the body's needs, and a person still moving enough through daily life to keep all of that machinery in working order. The hand isn't the story here. It's the messenger. It's worth wondering for a second why the body would settle on the hand for a job like this, of all places. Maybe it's simply that hands do so much, constantly, across a whole lifetime, gripping, releasing, twisting, catching, holding on, that they end up as an unusually honest, running record of whatever else is going on underneath. A muscle that only gets called on once in a while doesn't have much of a track record to reveal. A muscle used 100 times a day without fail can't hide much. In that sense, the hand's significance has less to do with its own importance than with how busy it stays, and that constant use tends to expose the truth. Now, here's where the research gets genuinely surprising. Surprising enough that a fair number of doctors had to rethink something they'd taken for granted for years. The study I mentioned a moment ago is known as the PURE study, short for Prospective Urban-Rural Epidemiology, led by a researcher named Darryl Leong and published in the Lancet in 2015. The scale of it alone is worth pausing on. This wasn't a small university trial with a few dozen volunteers. Researchers tracked over 140,000 adults spread across 17 countries, wealthy urban centers and rural communities with a fraction of the resources, different diets, different climates, different everything. What they were after was simple in concept, even if it took years of patient tracking to pull off. Measure each person's grip strength once with a basic dynamometer, and then follow what happened to their health in the years afterward. What they found was that grip strength predicted death from any cause, and death specifically from cardiovascular disease, more strongly than systolic blood pressure did. That's the top number in a blood pressure reading, the one your doctor watches most closely and has spent your whole adult life reminding you to keep in check. To put an actual number on it, for every 5 kilograms of grip strength a person was missing compared to someone stronger, their risk of dying from any cause climbed by roughly 16%. Their risk of dying specifically from a cardiovascular cause rose by about 17%, and their risk of stroke went up by somewhere around 9%. 5 kilograms, for what it's worth, isn't some dramatic gap between a weightlifter and an ordinary person. It's closer to the difference between confidently twisting off a tight bottle cap on the first try and needing to brace it against the edge of the counter first. What made researchers sit up wasn't just that grip strength mattered. Plenty of measurements correlate with health in some loose, minor way. It was that this one particular measurement, taken in a matter of seconds with no training and no expensive equipment, held up as a stronger predictor than a number the entire medical establishment had spent decades treating as close to gospel. Systolic blood pressure gets checked at nearly every doctor's visit a person will ever have, tracked on charts, targeted with medication, discussed at kitchen tables across the country. And here was a squeeze of the hand, quietly outperforming it across a population large enough and varied enough that it was hard to write off as some fluke of one country's diet or climate or health system. Now, before this starts sounding like some kind of countdown clock strapped to your wrist, let's be honest about what this finding actually means. Because it's easy to hear the phrase predicts mortality and picture something a lot more dramatic than what's actually going on underneath it. This isn't a sentence being handed down, it's a marker. Think of it less like a fortune teller reading your palm and more like the check engine light on a car's dashboard. The light itself isn't the problem. It's just wired into enough of the engine systems that it tends to notice trouble early, sometimes before the driver feels a single thing wrong. Grip strength seems to work the same way. It's wired indirectly into muscle health, nerve function, nutrition, and activity level all at once, so it tends to pick up a shift in any of those systems well before a person would notice it any other way. And here's the piece I want to straighten out, because it's a place people often get turned around. It's tempting to hear all this and assume the hands must be the first thing to go, as if the body runs through some fixed order of operations and grip strength sits first in line, a kind of early warning flare fired off before anything else notices trouble. The science actually tells a looser story than that, and precision matters here, because getting it backwards changes how frightening this whole conversation feels. Strength doesn't decline in some neat, orderly sequence. Hands first, and everything else trailing along behind. If anything, the muscles in the legs and hips tend to show wear earlier and more noticeably than grip does, since those are the muscles doing the heavy, unglamorous work of carrying body weight up a flight of stairs, out of a low chair, off the floor after gardening, every single day of a person's life. Grip strength isn't a signal that fires ahead of the pack. It's a window that happens to be unusually easy to measure, a small testable sample of something happening everywhere in the body at roughly the same time, not a warning bell mounted specifically on the hand. Think about it this way. Nobody puts a thermometer under one arm and assumes the other arm must be a degree behind it. A thermometer just happens to be a convenient place to sample the body's overall temperature. Grip strength plays a similar role for the muscular system as a whole. It's a sample, taken from a spot that's easy to reach and easy to measure, standing in for a process spread across muscles you'd never think to test on a Tuesday afternoon. The muscles along your spine holding you upright at the dinner table, the ones in your hips getting you out of the car, the ones in your calves keeping you steady on a curb. None of those get their own simple 10-second test the way the hand does. So the hand ends up doing double duty, telling a story that belongs to the whole body, not just to itself. So what's actually happening underneath all of this as the years quietly go by? There's a name for the broader process, and it's one worth knowing: sarcopenia. Strip away the medical dressing, and it simply means the gradual loss of muscle mass and strength that comes with getting older. It isn't some rare condition that strikes a small, unlucky slice of the population. It's closer to a nearly universal part of how bodies age, one that tends to start a good deal earlier than most people assume. Past the age of 30, an age most people still associate with being in their physical prime, muscle mass tends to decline somewhere in the range of 3 to 8% per decade. That's a genuinely quiet number. Nobody wakes up one Tuesday having felt 3% of anything disappear over the preceding 10 years. It happens far below the threshold of daily notice. But that quiet pace doesn't hold steady forever. Past 60, the decline tends to pick up speed, sometimes considerably, the way a slow leak in a tire seems to accelerate in its later stretch, whether or not anyone's watching for it. This is the same slow current running underneath all sorts of small, forgettable moments most people never think to connect to one another. A jar that used to open on the first twist now sometimes takes a second try. Climbing a flight of stairs that used to pass without a thought now earns a brief pause at the landing. A grandchild gets just a little heavier every year, and somewhere in there, picking them up stops being quite as effortless as it once was. None of that, on its own, means anything alarming. It's just the ordinary sound of the same background process the pure researchers were measuring with their dynamometers, showing up in daily life instead of on a chart. Here's the part that tends to surprise people most, though, and it's worth sitting with a moment because it reframes the whole conversation in a useful way. Strength fades even faster than muscle mass itself does. A person can hold onto a fairly decent amount of muscle tissue while still losing a meaningful share of the force that muscle is actually capable of producing. There's a specific term researchers use for this particular piece of the puzzle: Dynapenia, the age-related loss of muscle strength and power, distinct from the shrinking of the muscle tissue itself. In plain terms, the muscle might still be sitting there, roughly the size it's always been, while the ability to make it fire hard and fire fast starts slipping sooner than you'd think and drifts further than the shrinking alone would explain. Think of it a little like a dimmer switch losing some of its range while the bulb itself is perfectly fine. The bulb hasn't burned out. It's not even dimmer at its lowest setting. But turn the switch all the way up, and it doesn't quite reach the brightness it used to. The muscle is the bulb. The nervous system driving it is the switch. And it's the switch, more often than the bulb, that starts losing a bit of its range first. Why would strength go faster than size? Muscle is wired straight into the nervous system, a living circuit, not simply tissue sitting quietly under the skin. One of the quieter, less discussed parts of aging is that the connections between motor neurons and individual muscle fibers become less reliable as the years accumulate. Some fibers lose their nerve connection entirely and essentially go dark, no longer answering when the brain sends down the signal to fire, the way a porch light stops responding once the wire behind the switch has frayed. The body does its best to compensate. We read all this rerouting some of that lost work onto neighboring fibers and the neurons still intact and functioning. It's an impressively resourceful patch job, the kind of quiet adaptation the body performs constantly without any applause. But a patch job still means the whole system isn't running with quite the same coordinated efficiency it once had. And a simple hand grip test happens to be remarkably good at picking that difference up, even when nothing about a person's day-to-day life feels any different yet. This is also part of why researchers have started referring to grip strength as something close to a vital sign for aging, spoken of in the same breath as blood pressure, pulse, and temperature, a framing used in a research review by Richard Bohannon in 2019. Not because the hand itself is somehow more important than any other muscle in the body, it plainly isn't, but because it's cheap to measure, takes about 10 seconds with a simple squeeze, and happens to reflect the state of the whole muscular and nervous system with a level of accuracy that would otherwise take far more time and equipment to get at. A doctor can't easily measure the strength of your diaphragm during a routine office visit or the small stabilizing muscles running along your spine. But your hand? That, they can measure in about the time it takes to say good morning. I want to slow down here for a moment, though, because I don't want any of this landing as a scare, and it shouldn't. This isn't about watching your own hands like a clock counting down towards something. Nobody's ordinary, day-to-day strength fades on some fixed schedule like a countdown timer. What we're talking about here isn't a jar lid that opens easily on Monday and won't budge at all by Friday. That kind of sudden change would be its own, entirely different story. One worth a same-day call to a doctor, not a video like this one. For the overwhelming majority of people, what the research actually describes is gradual. A long, gentle curve, not a cliff edge. Muscle and strength quietly slip, a little at a time, year over year, at a pace that's genuinely hard to notice in the middle of ordinary life. Which is exactly why a measurement like grip strength turns out to be useful in the first place. It catches something that your own daily experience is poorly equipped to catch on its own, precisely because the change is so gradual. so evenly spread across thousands of unremarkable mornings that no single one of them ever feels different from the last. And here's where the story turns genuinely hopeful, because this next part tends to surprise people even more than the mortality figures did. This whole process, steady and quiet as it is, isn't a one-way street with the door locked behind it. Muscle tissue can still respond to training even very late in life. Even in people in their 90s, an age a lot of us would assume was well past the point of responding to anything at all. There's a study from 1990 published in the Journal of the American Medical Association and led by researcher Maria Fiatarone that looked at a group of frail adults living in a nursing home, men and women in their 80s and 90s, some dealing with real physical limitations. Not exactly the picture of vigorous aging you'd see plastered across a fitness magazine cover. Researchers put this group through a program of resistance training, the kind of simple, deliberate strength work most people assume is reserved for the young, and people well into their 90s gained real measurable muscle strength through that training. Muscle tissue that had spent decades quietly losing ground responded, at an age most of us would have assumed was long past the point of building anything back at all. Picture the people in that room for a moment. These weren't retirees jogging around a track, already halfway fit and looking to sharpen up. Many of them needed help simply getting around. And yet the tissue in their legs and arms, tissue that had been on a slow downward slope for the better part of 70 or 80 years, still had enough left in it to answer when asked. That's a remarkable thing for a muscle fiber to be capable of, at an age when most of us assume the door has long since closed. That finding matters well beyond the specific people in that one study, because of what it implies about the nature of the whole process we've been talking about. Sarcopenia and Dynapenia aren't a locked door slamming shut somewhere in a person's 50s, 60s, or 70s, sealing off any possibility of change. They describe a tendency. A direction muscle tends to drift in the absence of anything pushing back against that drift. But muscle tissue, it turns out, keeps listening, even very late in life. In the specific case researchers tested, people in their 90s, it responded to the right kind of signal in ways that would have seemed almost far-fetched before anyone actually went and tested it directly and watched it happen. So where does that leave the handshake, the jar lid, the grocery bags up the porch steps, the garden hose you wrestle with every summer, the deck of cards you shuffle on a Friday night, the fishing rod you cast off the end of a dock? I'd say it leaves them as something worth a bit of curiosity rather than worry. The next time you notice how a squeeze feels, easy and effortless, the way it's always been, or maybe just a touch harder than you remember it being a few years back, that's not a diagnosis, and it's certainly not a verdict on how many years you've got left. It's a small, honest signal from a system that's constantly taking inventory of itself, whether you're paying attention to it or not. Worth noticing, worth a bit of curiosity, not worth losing sleep over. If something about your own strength has genuinely changed in a way that concerns you, the slow, ordinary drift we've been talking about here, that's worth raising with your doctor at your next visit, someone who can actually put hands and instruments on the problem in a way no video ever could. A sudden loss of strength is a different matter entirely, especially if it's on just one side of your body. One hand or one leg suddenly weaker than the other, out of nowhere. That's not a wait-and-see situation. Sudden, one-sided weakness can be a sign of something like a stroke, and it belongs in an emergency room, not on next month's calendar. Either way, they can measure what's going on directly. They know your history, your medications, the particulars that make you you in a way I simply can't from here. My job is to help you understand the why behind what your body quietly does over the years. The what to do about it belongs with the person who actually knows your chart. Or, if the change came on suddenly and to one side, with the nearest emergency room. That's really the whole shape of what we've covered here. A squeeze of the hand that seems almost too small to matter. Tracked across 140,000 people and somehow outperforming a number doctors have leaned on for generations. Add to that a quiet, ordinary decline that starts earlier than most people expect and doesn't announce itself with any single dramatic moment. A myth worth retiring, the idea that the hands go first, when the truth is closer to a window opening onto the whole body at once. And underneath all of it, a stubborn, hopeful fact that, even very late in life, muscle still listens. And if this is the kind of thing that gets your curiosity going, the strange, quiet ways your own body keeps score on itself, the sort of thing that never once came up in any biology class you sat through, stay a while. I've got plenty more of these tucked away, waiting to be pulled out into the light. Hit subscribe if you'd like me to keep digging them up for you.